She did not look at him when he said it. That was the part she remembered most clearly, years later. Not the words themselves, but the moment before them when the fire in the east parlor had been crackling in that particular way. It always did on November evenings, and the smell of roasted parsnips had been coming through from the kitchen. And everything had seemed, for just a breath, almost fine, almost ordinary, almost like a household where a woman might sit at the table and feel that she belonged there. And then Edmund. No, she reminded herself. His name was not Edmund. His name was Percival Howe, and she had been married to him for 14 months. And she still sometimes forgot to think of him by the name she had promised to honor at the altar of St. Andrew's, in the autumn of 1871. Percival said, "She looks like a woman who has never been told no." He was speaking to his sister. Constance was seated across the table, cutting her pheasant into very small pieces, and she laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, but in the way people laugh when they are relieved it is not them being spoken about. Their mother, Mrs. Vera Howe, sat at the head of the table and said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. Honoria set her knife down on the rim of her plate. She set it down carefully, without a sound. The candles between them threw long shadows up the walls. She was 24 years old. She had been born Honoria Platt, in the county of Lanark, and she had been raised to hold herself well and speak clearly and do useful things with her hands. She had been taught to read account books and to dress a wound and to argue a point without raising her voice. Her mother had told her, more than once, that these were the qualities that would carry her through whatever life brought. What life had brought was Percival Howe. The arrangement had been made between her father and Percival's uncle when Honoria was 22 and Percival was 31, and she had understood from the beginning that it was a practical matter, not a romantic one. Percival had land in Nova Scotia, a good timber property near Antigonish, and her father had debts that were not spoken about aloud, but that everyone in the family knew by feel, the way you know a cold room before you open the door. The marriage would settle the debts and secure the land's management. Honoria would be provided for. Percival would have a wife who could run a household without needing to be supervised. It had seemed, in the abstract, reasonable. She had arrived at Ashgrove, the Howe family's house, a long gray stone building set back from the road in a stand of old spruce, in October of 1870, 2 weeks before the wedding. Percival had met her at the door, and she had thought, "He is not unkind, he has a steady look about him. This will be manageable." She had not yet met Mrs. Vera Howe. Vera was Percival's mother, and she had lived at Ashgrove for all of her 61 years, and intended, she made quietly clear, to continue doing so. She had strong opinions about the correct temperature for a household, and the correct way to fold linen, and the correct hours for meals, and the correct manner of addressing the farm hands. She had, as it happened, strong opinions about Honoria as well. They were not favorable opinions. "She is thin through the shoulders," Vera had said to Constance, on Honoria's third day at the house. Honoria had been on the other side of a door that did not quite close, which was a quality shared by several doors at Ashgrove. "She carries herself like she expects to be waited upon." Honoria had gone back to her room and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the spruce trees for a long time. She had not wept, she had not seen the point. What Vera had understood from the beginning was that Honoria was not afraid of her. This was the problem. Vera had managed a large household for 40 years, and she had managed it through the particular authority that comes from being the one person in a room who is never uncertain. She did not raise her voice, she did not make scenes. She simply held herself with such absolute conviction that she was correct that other people found themselves agreeing with her before they had quite decided to. Honoria had not agreed with her. She had been polite. She had been careful. She had deferred on matters of the household, the temperature of the rooms, the hour of supper, the arrangement of the parlor furniture, because these were Vera's domain, and Honoria understood that coming in and immediately rearranging things would be both rude and pointless. But she had not pretended to believe things she did not believe. And when Vera had made a remark in the first month of the marriage about the way Honoria had answered back to the solicitor who came about the property boundary on the eastern field, "A woman ought not to insert herself into matters of title and survey," Honoria had said, pleasantly, that she had been raised to understand property law, and that she had simply pointed out an error in the notation. Vera had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had turned and walked out of the room. It had gotten worse after that. Not dramatically. That was the thing about Vera. She did not do anything dramatically. She made remarks, small ones, precisely placed. Honoria seems to have forgotten that this is not her father's house. Honoria's way of managing the kitchen staff is unconventional, I suppose one must make allowances. I simply wonder sometimes whether Percival considered what he was bringing into this household. And Percival? Percival said nothing. That was the part Honoria had not anticipated. She had understood that her husband would not be a romantic figure, that theirs would be a partnership of utility rather than feeling. She had made her peace with that. What she had not considered was that he might simply be absent. Not absent from the house. He was there most evenings. He came to supper. He moved through the rooms. But absent in the way that matters. He did not hear what his mother said. Or if he heard, he did not register it as something that required a response. Honoria had told herself in the first months that this was simply his manner. He was a quiet man. He was not deliberately cruel. By the third month, she had told herself he was tired. By the sixth month, she had stopped telling herself anything. She managed the household accounts, which were in poor order when she arrived, and became considerably less so. She oversaw the repair of the eastern fence, which had been incorrectly surveyed, and was encroaching on the neighboring property. A situation that had been generating small, simmering disputes for 3 years, and that Honoria resolved in 6 weeks by writing 3 letters and accompanying the surveyor herself to the field boundary. She kept the kitchen running through a bad winter when 2 of the house staff fell sick, and she tended to Constance when Constance came down with a fever in February, and she sat with the lambing through 3 nights in March, when the shepherd's boy was too young and too frightened to manage it alone. She was useful. She was competent. She did not complain. And none of it made any difference to Vera. The evening of the dinner was in the 2nd November of the marriage. It had been a long day. The supply merchant from Truro had come to discuss the spring timber contract, and Percival had asked Honoria to review the figures before the meeting, and she had found an error in the board footage calculation that would have cost the property considerably. She had corrected it. The meeting had gone well. Percival had thanked her in the way he thanked her for things, briefly, looking slightly to the side of her face, and she had thought for a moment that something was shifting. Then at supper, Vera had begun. It started with something small. Honoria had refilled her own wine glass without waiting for the girl to come round, and Vera had watched this and said, to the table generally, that she had always felt a woman's manner at table spoke volumes about how she had been raised. Honoria had continued eating. Then Vera had asked Constance about the Hendersons' daughter, who had recently married, and Constance had said she was very pretty, and the Henderson family were very pleased, and Vera had sighed in a particular way, and said that some women were simply born to make a home. Honoria had set down her fork, picked it up again and taken another bite. And then Percival, who had been eating in silence, who had not looked up from his plate in 20 minutes, said without any apparent intention, without heat or malice, the way a man states a fact he considers too obvious to require emphasis, Honoria has never been what one would call easy to look at. The fire crackled. The candle nearest to Honoria threw a long shadow up the wall and trembled once in some slight draught from the door. No one at the table moved. Constance's eyes went to her plate. Vera looked, for just a moment, satisfied. The way a woman looks when something she has been trying to cultivate has finally come up from the ground. Honoria looked at her husband for the first time in several minutes. He had returned to his food. He appeared to consider the matter closed. She thought, 14 months. She thought, this is what the next 40 years will feel like. She set her napkin beside her plate. She pushed her chair back very slowly, so that it made no sound on the stone floor. She stood. And then she did the thing she did not quite plan and would, in later years, be unable to explain entirely. She curtsied. It was a small curtsy, precise and composed, the kind she had been taught as a girl for greeting people of consequence. She curtsied to her husband and his sister and his mother, and then she walked out of the dining room. And her footsteps on the stairs were perfectly even all the way up. She did not allow herself to think while she packed. This was important. She had learned, in the past year, that thinking at the wrong moment was dangerous, that if she sat down in the middle of something difficult and allowed herself to examine it fully, she would find herself paralyzed by the weight of it. So she moved. She took out the smaller of her 2 traveling cases, the one she had brought from her father's house, and she began to put things into it with the methodical attention she might have given to any practical task. Her work journal, the leather ledger, with the account figures she had maintained for the property, her mother's garnet brooch, 3 dresses, the dark green wool, the gray sarge, the blue cotton that had seen better days but was comfortable for traveling, stockings, underlinen, her spare boots, the small medical case, the 2 books she had been reading, her pen case and the box of letters from home. She worked quietly. The house was not quiet. She could hear voices downstairs, Vera's particular carrying tone, and once the sound of Percival pushing back his chair. But her room was at the back of the house, and sound had to travel some distance to reach it. She realized as she buckled the case, somewhere to go. This was not something she had planned, but it was something she had. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had come from a woman named Mrs. Alderton in Halifax, the wife of a solicitor, who had heard about the property survey work Honoria had done on the Ashgrove eastern boundary, and who had found himself with a similar problem on a property his firm managed. He had written to ask if she might be available to consult. Honoria had written back to say she would consider it. She had not yet replied further, because she had told herself there was no reason to. She understood now that there was. She sat down at the small writing desk and wrote a letter to Mrs. Alderton's husband. She kept it brief and professional. She said she had reconsidered, and that she believed she could be available to assist in the new year, and that she would be glad to discuss the particulars if he cared to write to her at the address of her cousin, Mrs. Tabitha Price, in Dartmouth. She sealed the letter. She wrote a second letter to Tabitha, who was a sensible woman who had met Percival once, and said only, on the drive home from that particular occasion, "Well, Honoria, I do hope you know what you're doing." Honoria had said she did. She suspected Tabitha had not believed her. She wrote, "I am coming. I am sorry for the short notice. I will explain in full when I arrive." She put on her traveling coat. She carried both letters and her case out into the hall. She left the letters on the table near the front door, where the morning post was always laid. The household letter would be collected and sent with the morning delivery, and by then she would already be gone. She did not look at the dining room door as she passed. The night outside was cold and very clear. There was a half moon above the spruce line. She walked the 2 miles to the village without stopping, and she waited at the inn until the first coach south, which departed at 5:15 in the morning, and she sat in the corner of the carriage with her case on her lap, and watched the gray dawn come up over the hills, and she did not weep. She was 24 years old. She had corrected a surveyor's error, and brought 3 lambs through a bad night, and run a household of 11 people through a winter, and she was going to be all right. She told herself this. After a while, she almost believed it. Tabitha had a house on a quiet street 2 blocks from the harbor, and she opened the door when Honoria arrived without any expression of surprise, which was one of the things Honoria had always admired most about her. She said, "Come in. There's soup." That was all. She did not ask questions until Honoria had eaten, and then she asked only the one that mattered. "Do you want to go back?" Honoria said no. Tabitha nodded. She said, "All right, then let's work out what comes next." What came next was in its practical dimensions manageable. Tabitha had space. Honoria had skills. Mr. Alderton's letter arrived within the week, and within a fortnight Honoria had made herself indispensable to a firm that had been making an expensive recurring error in the way it read old land grants. She was careful and quiet about it. She did not announce herself. She simply made herself useful, and useful people, she had found, tend to find that there is always more use for them. There was a harder dimension too. It arrived in the form of a letter from Percival. It came 3 weeks after she had left Ashgrove, and she sat with it in Tabitha's kitchen for a long time before she opened it. She had expected anger, or indifference, or a formal note about the property, asking when she intended to return. She had not expected what she found. He had written, "I have sat with what I said at table, and I find I cannot account for it in any way that satisfies me. I did not mean the words to carry the weight they carried. I understand that this may seem an insufficient thing to say. I do not know what would be sufficient. I find I have been thinking about it at considerable length." The letter was not long, and it was not eloquent, and it was not the letter of a man who found the expressing of interior states to be something that came naturally to him. But it was honest, in the way that things are honest when a person has not had time to make them polished. He had crossed out a line near the bottom. She could see the heavy ink beneath the scratch, and she spent some time wondering what the crossed-out line had said. He had added below his name, "I am told you have been consulting on land survey matters in Halifax." I am not surprised. She read the letter twice. Then she put it face down on the kitchen table. She thought about what she had expected from a marriage and what it had been. And she thought about the man she had believed Percival might be in the first week at Ashgrove, before the rooms had narrowed and his mother's presence had taken up all the available air. She thought about the evenings when he had come in from the fields in a particular state of tiredness, and sat by the fire and not spoken, and she had not spoken either, and it had been, in its quiet way, a kind of company. She thought about the curtsy. She allowed herself, for the first time, to find that slightly funny. Percival came to Halifax himself 6 weeks after the letter. He came alone, which surprised her. She had half expected Vera to come with him, as a matter of principle, and the fact that he had not brought her said something, though Honoria was not yet certain what. He arrived at Mr. Alderton's office on a Thursday afternoon, where Honoria was in the middle of explaining to a clerk the difference between a deed of covenant and a deed of grant, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and waited until she had finished. She looked at him, he looked back. He appeared to have slept poorly for some weeks. She said, "I'll be done in 20 minutes if you want to wait." He said, "I'll wait." She was done in 15. She took her coat and they walked out into the grey Halifax afternoon together, down toward the waterfront, where the wind came off the harbor and smelled of salt and wood smoke. He said, "I want to understand what I did." She said, "You said I was not easy to look at. At the table, in front of your mother and your sister." He said, "Yes," and then he said, "I don't think I believed it when I said it. I don't know why I said it." She had thought, in the weeks since, about what answer she would give to this if he ever came. She had several prepared, careful ones, sharp ones. One that was kind and one that was not. What she said instead was, "I think you said it because your mother expected you to say something like it, and it was easier to give her what she expected than to consider whether it was true." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "That's not a defense," she said. "No, it's not." The harbor was gray-green and restless. A large ship was coming in slowly from the south, and they watched it for a while in silence. And Honoria thought about her father's house in Lanark and the lambs in March, and the particular way the spruce trees looked from her bedroom window at Ashgrove on a clear night. She said, "I am not going to come back the same way I left." He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means that if I come back, certain things will be different. Your mother may stay at Ashgrove. I am not going to ask you to remove her from her own home, but she will not run the household. I will. And if she speaks about me the way she has been speaking about me since I arrived, I will leave again, and I will not come back a second time." She said, "And you will need to be present, not perform being present. Actually present. When something happens in that house that concerns me, you will need to see it." He said nothing for a long time. She waited, because she had learned to wait. He said, "I think I have been present for very little of what has concerned you in this marriage." She said yes. He said, "I am not certain I know how to change that." She said, "I know. But I need you to try." What she did not know, and would only understand later, was what had happened at Ashgrove in the weeks after she left. Constance told her, eventually, over tea in the kitchen, that Honoria had by then made properly her own. She told it in the way Constance told things, circuitously, with digressions, backtracking to fill in details she'd forgotten. And Honoria listened to all of it without interrupting. Vera, it seemed, had been furious, not at Percival, at herself. This surprised Honoria until it didn't. Vera was a woman who had managed everything for so long that failure of management, which was how she experienced Honoria's departure, landed on her as a kind of personal defeat. She had stalked through Ashgrove for 3 days, Constance said, finding fault with everything and everyone, and then on the 4th day she had sat down in the east parlor, and been silent for a very long time. She had said finally, "She ran this household better than anyone has in 20 years. Constance had not responded, which was the wisest thing Constance had ever done. Vera had said, "I drove her out." She had sat with that for a while. She had said, "I drove her out because I was afraid of what it would mean if someone else could do it better." It was not, Constance said, an apology. It was more like a reckoning. The kind a person does when they have been alone with themselves long enough that there is nothing left to argue with. Vera had not said any of this to Honoria directly. She was not, perhaps, capable of that. But when Honoria came back to Ashgrove in the spring, Vera had been at the door, and she had met Honoria's eyes, and she had said, "Mrs. Howe," not as a dismissal, just as an acknowledgement. A door opening, Honoria had said, "Mrs. Howe," and they had both understood what had passed between them. She had been back at Ashgrove for a year and a half when she found the crossed-out line in Percival's letter. She had been sorting through the desk in the small study, which had become, by gradual negotiation, a shared space, which was more than she had expected, and the letter had come loose from the back of a drawer where it had been sitting since spring. She unfolded it. She read it again, though she knew it by heart. She looked, this time, more carefully at the heavy ink scratch below the 3rd paragraph. She had a technique for reading crossed-out lines that she had learned from her father, who had been a meticulous, but also a frequently second-guessing man. You held the paper at an angle to the light, and looked at the pressure of the original strokes. She held it to the window. She could make out, "I have missed your company at the table every evening since you left," which I recognize is not the point. But which is true? She set the letter down. Outside the window, the spruce trees were doing what spruce trees do in April in Nova Scotia, which is to say they were exactly the same as they had been in February, and would be in October, deeply and consistently themselves. Below the window, in the yard, she could hear Percival talking to the youngest of the farm hands about something to do with the fence on the north field, his voice carrying in the clear morning air, with the patience of a man who has learned, slowly, that being present is not a natural state for him, but is a necessary one. She folded the letter and put it back in the drawer. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The Alderton firm had sent another inquiry, this one about a property dispute in Pictou County that sounded genuinely tangled, and she had promised a reply by the end of the week. The kitchen garden was ready to be turned. Constance was coming for Sunday dinner and had, for the third time in as many months, mentioned a young schoolteacher in Antigonish, in a way that suggested she wanted advice more than she wanted it to appear. She was asking for it. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and went to her desk and picked up her pen. She thought about 14 months of saying nothing, and 6 weeks of Halifax, and a grey afternoon by the harbour, and a man standing in a solicitor's doorway with his hat in his hands. She thought, this is not the marriage I expected. She dipped the pen and began to write. She thought, but it is finally beginning to be a marriage.